Welcome this Tuesday afternoon to the Strum Center guest lecture by Professor Ivy Sichel on the rise of modern vernacular Hebrew. My name is Madar Ben-Natan, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow and a visiting professor at the Israel Studies program here at the Strum Center. We open every event of the University of Washington by acknowledging the Coast Salish people of this land, the land which touches on the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Duwamish, Puyallup, Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. This event is made possible by the generous support of the community of donors of the Strum Center. Many of you are in the audience today, and on behalf of all of us, thank you for your generosity. Today's talk would also not be possible without the group of professionals at the Strum Center who work every day to bring quality academic, thought-provoking programming to new audiences. Those professionals include Sarah Zaitis-Rosen, Kara Schoonmaker, Grace Elizabeth D., and Daniel Wang, and we thank you for your dedicated work. The talk today will be about an hour long, and after that, we'll have an audience Q&A with Professor Sichel that I will moderate. In order to keep the focus on the presentation, attendees in this Zoom webinar do not have video and microphone enabled. I welcome you to submit your questions via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen throughout the event. And now finally, I want to present Professor Ivy Sichel. She is an associate professor of linguistics at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Her work focuses on syntactic theory. She is also interested in the sociolinguistics of the revival of Hebrew speech and has written about women's contribution to the revival project at the turn of the 20th century with her collaborator Miri Bar-Ziv-Levi, and about the relationship between the revival and the establishment of the State of Israel with Uri Moore. The work she's presenting today on the rise of modern vernacular Hebrew, how language shapes identity and vice versa, was also co-authored with Uri Moore. Professor Sichel, now the floor is yours. We look forward to hearing you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks also to the organizers for inviting me and for doing such an amazing job pulling all the pieces together. I'll be talking today about a project on the relationship between language and identity based on the special case of modern Hebrew, in which a new language variety and a new identity emerge around the same time and co-construct each other. So I'll share my screen. Okay, so during the debate over the normalcy of Hebrew in 1953, the Israeli linguist Chaim Rosen published a response to Ze'ev Ben Chaim, a scholar of Hebrew and Aramaic and a leading figure in the Academy of Hebrew. In this paper, Rosen distinguishes between the non-prescriptive standard and the prescriptive norm, and noted about the current state of affairs that the psychological effect of complete separation between the language of speech and the elevated language of culture is clear. A person who constantly hears that the language they speak is incorrect will end up with a who cares attitude, even when making an actual mistake which truly deserves correction. My language is uncivilized anyway, they will say to themselves. This early comment on linguistic reality in Israel is illuminating in two ways. First, sorry about that. So the early comment is illuminating in two ways. First, because it identifies a double standard in modern Hebrew, the existence of two hegemonic varieties, a prescriptive norm associated with textual correctness, alongside a vernacular norm associated with spontaneity and native language-based correctness. And second, because it heralds in a new native-born identity and a new anti-intellectual stance rooted in language and attitudes in language, the who cares attitude that, that Rosen mentions. So the rise of modern vernacular Hebrew gives rise to a general question: how does value accrue to language varieties? How did they rise from spoken varieties to standard national languages? Our case study is vernacular modern Hebrew, so we can ask this question in this particular context. How did the new native vernacular eventually eclipse the prestigious prescriptive variety to become the Hebrew standard? We'll be exploring these questions in two domains. First, we'll be analyzing the new native vernacular style and the social meanings embedded within it. We'll be showing that it's a reflexive style. In other words, it refers to itself and it speaks for itself, for the authority of experience as opposed to the traditional authority of the text. This means that a speaker of modern vernacular Hebrew is therefore necessarily the subject of a positive attitude towards the vernacular and therefore an active agent in the dissemination of the new collective values. Then we'll turn to the activity of cultural agents and the related vernacular values that they promoted. We'll show how the style served as an effective medium for embodying the collective. Nothing expresses the relationship between the new native vernacular and the new collective better than the title of Rosen's pioneering study of Israeli Hebrew titled Our Hebrew. The goal of our study is to examine the process of enregisterment. Enregisterment is the name that Asif Aga gives to the set of processes through which a linguistic repertoire becomes individuated as a socially recognized register. And will focus specifically on value production and on the dissemination of these new values. To sharpen our understanding of the tight connections between language and identity formation in the service of a new national collective, we'll be applying tools from third wave sociolinguistics. We'll be talking about the ideological underpinnings of style, about the role of stance, the semiotics of social meaning, and orders of indexicality, all of which I'll be explaining. So the structure of the talk is as follows. We'll start with some background on the two hegemonic standards. From there, we'll move on to talk about the style. And then we'll look at some emblematic texts by an important cultural agent in the early 50s, Dan Ben Amotz, and his collection Manishma, and then we'll conclude. So let's start with some background on the two hegemonic standards. Native vernacular Hebrew emerged during the Ottoman period in Palestine in the mid-1890s with the offspring of the very first immigrants in the modern Zionist era. These early speakers were the first to attend the first Hebrew nursery school. During these early decades, people spoke, but in different ways. By the 1930s, a new native way of speaking was identified. The new native speakers, mostly very young, were designated as Sabras. Yet for several decades, the native vernacular was considered a sub-appropriate child language, which would become improved with appropriate correction and over time, and it was excluded from the public domain. So it was excluded from writing, but also excluded from theater, radio, films of the period. It was excluded from assemblies and even private diaries. In all these arenas, only the formal non-native standard was used. During this period, the dominant language in the Jewish Yishuv was a planned Hebrew language based primarily on classical Hebrew, but it also incorporated later features. The goal of the language planners who designed the new language, these were scholars and educators, was to create a uniform national Hebrew standard, which would be both authentic and modern. And although it was used occasionally in speech, in courtrooms and classrooms, it remained symbolic and never became a native language. So this status quo was disrupted by the events of roughly between 1945 and 1949, both the massive waves of immigration and the establishment of the State of Israel, culminating in the emergence of the double standard. So during the 40s and 50s, when this was happening, a very diverse group of speakers were using Hebrew. So just to make this concrete, consider a speech community that included non-native pioneers, native Hebrew speakers, the Sabras, descendants of the old Jewish settlement, new immigrants from Europe, and new immigrants from North Africa and the Middle East. So this is enormous diversity in the speech community. The Jewish immigrants brought with them diverse varieties of Hebrew, which posed a significant threat to the hard-won dominance of the new local varieties. Fear of the Oriental other was compounded by fears that Yiddish would regain its privileged status. These impacted the language norms on both sides. Fear of cultural change triggered an increase in prescriptive activity. For example, the establishment of the Academy for the Hebrew Language in 1953, a proliferation of prescriptive literature, materials for teaching Hebrew, all of these, which the Sabras challenged by consolidating their native-based style and investing it with new authority. A central component of the emergent identity was the new native vernacular, further elaborated to distinguish it as a hegemonic variety. So, as a hegemonic variety that replaced textual correctness with a new experience-based measure of correctness. Okay, so on the one hand, we have massive waves of immigrant and a set of concerns and fears that raises. Another factor during the same time is the establishment of the State of Israel and the shifts that brought on, sectorial shift, generational shift, political cultural shift. During this time, new oppositions emerged, especially between the individual and the state, with a new focus on the personal, realized also in the literature of the post-1948 era. And parallel to this development was also a transformation in language and a shift away from the traditional Jewish authority of the text towards a new authority rooted in the experience of the native born. And it's in this context that the new native vernacular begins to gain new currency. So all of these shifts lead to a shift in language, both increased prescriptivism and purism, but also legitimation of the new native vernacular, which then lead to the double standard, where we have an institutional variety, which is bound to a prescriptive norm, and a native variety, which is bound to a conventional norm. Okay, so this is the double standard. We can see this in registerment. In other words, the consolidation of the style and its new values depicted in illustrations of the period, such as this illustration from 1951 by Elisheva Nadel-Landau, published in a youth magazine. So it's an illustration of a boy, his bruises, his bandages, shorts and sandals speak to outdoorsy, rambunctious activity, but also his composure and facial expression, that slight dissent or mild suspicion facial expression are also telling. The generational differences, especially with respect to language, as it aligns with other behavioral attributes, can be seen in the following clip from a film called Wood and Gun, which was made in 1979, but it depicts a period in the narrator's life taking place in 1950. And in the clip that we'll be looking at, there's an opposition between the language and behavior of the children and the language and behavior of the teacher. So those of you who have some Hebrew, know some Hebrew, see if you can identify any differences between the language of the kids and the language of the teacher.
זה מה שאני רוצה עכשיו. הם כולם היו שם שעדי שבר את היד. הם גם כולם ישלמו. אבל רק מחר מורידים לך את הגבת. זה לא מוקדם מדי? כבר חיכי אותי חודש, זה מספיק, אני לא מחכה יותר. אם לא היית הולך לבד בלילה בגן, בשבילים סדיים, לא היה כל העסק הזה בכלל. מותר ללכת איפה שאני רוצה ומתי שאני רוצה, זו מדינה חופשית.
אדון יונתן שרייר, תרשה לי להזכיר לך שמחר מסירים את הכבש מעל ידך ותוכל להרביץ לחבריך בשתי ידיים. מה דעתך? זה מה אינני מכיר אותך בזמן הקרוב. הגענו! תלמידים, הגענו!
זה. מה העניינים? תחמושת! אלה הבובקס הכי קשים בארץ. זה יביא לנו את הניצחון. בשביל מה באנו הנה, נוח? למה חיים? סתם באנו הנה. אחריי! פולנו סחב אותנו. נוח השתגע בחיי.
ירושלים. ירושלים. חלום דורות. ירושלים. עיר הנצח. אלפי דורות חלמנו עלייך. ירושלים.
רואים כאן רק ערים, ירושלים.
ברוך אתה, אדוני, שהחיינו וקיימנו והגיענו לזמן הזה.
אמן.
כן, ירושלים.
לא אין שום ירושלים.
מה אתה עושה? מה אתה עושה שם?
מה הוא מחפש?
אני אשמח לשוחח עם אמא שלך כשנחזור לבית הספר. מה זה?
So the clip contrasts the forefathers, who are the parents and educators, with the Sabras, the older generation with the younger generation, the polite and restrained with the outspoken and wild younger generation, and textual authority with a new authority, which is based in experience. Both varieties are nationalistic and hegemonic. So how did the new native vernacular rise to become a hegemonic standard? The attitudes which contributed to its promotion were inscribed directly in the distinctively native speech style, to which we turn next. So I'm going to start with a humoristic skit written very early by Uri Avneri in 1946, kind of exaggerating the style, again, by contrasting the Sabra style with the style of the interviewer. But it also betrays a very early self-awareness of what was special about the Sabra style. Okay, so we have a conversation between an interviewer and a sabrologist, humorously called a sabrologist. Please forgive me for intruding. I would like to, how should I put it? Grab a chat? Precisely. I was hoping you would be so kind as to answer some queries. Maybe, maybe not. Many thanks. So, do you study Sabras? Yep, I'm totally into it. Into it? On top of it. What is the general public opinion about the Sabra? That doesn't count. And now in closing, does the Sabra distinguish between Sabra and non-Sabra things, and how? What does he call Sabra things? That's ours. And how does he define non-Sabra things? That's not ours. That's lame. That's nothing special. I do not wish to take up any more of your time. Please allow me to express my sincere gratitude. Cut the bull. Shalom. Another place in which we find features characterizing the new style is in an enormous amount of expressions in particular semantic fields. Many of them are new slang expressions, somewhat idiomatic, so I hope they won't be completely lost in translation. Let's try. So one area in which we find a really interesting density of expressions is expressions about language, meta-linguistic expressions. Things like don't scramble up my brain, stop philosophizing, those are pharmacy words, intelligno for intelligent, rattles in a cattle, bombarding words, and many more. Another area is in the expression of disdain for authority. So again, I hope the juiciness of these expressions won't be completely lost in translation. Things like, I put him in my small pocket, I put a strike through, my granny's joy, we've heard all about you, he discovered America, and so on. So style has meaning, and that includes linguistic style. But the kind of meaning that's associated with style is different from the meaning associated normally with words and sentences in language. And this is a social meaning derived by semiotic processes, which are not specific to language. So what is a linguistic style? It's said to be an expression of a set of stances, evaluative attitudes, typically towards other ways of speaking from which it distinguishes itself. A central mechanism for deriving social meaning, one of these semiotic processes, is indexicality. So indexicality is an interpretive mechanism by which some linguistic feature comes to index a social group or groups, along with the values and behaviors stereotypically associated with that group. And by index, I simply mean points to a linguistic feature that points to a group, such that when we as members of a speech community hear a certain word or even pronunciation, that social group is evoked. Okay, so that's indexicality, the pointing to a particular group. Linguists have pointed out that indexicality is ideological in the sense that it produces a natural association between the feature and the group, as if the feature expressed true essence. So coming back to the skit, the native style in the skit is constructed in opposition to the formal style of the interviewer. It's characterized in terms of content, but not only, also in terms of linguistic form and language use parameters like politeness and rudeness, which are aligned to consolidate the social meaning of the two styles. The caricature of the formal style in the skit represents the native stance, the dismissive attitude towards the elevated style. The skit therefore activates the stance at the core of the native style. So when we laugh with the skit, we're laughing as a sabra at the institutional standard. More generally, we can say that the native style is constructed as a set of stances towards a set of alternative styles, all of them non-native. So what are the alternative uses of Hebrew in the immediate context? There's the traditional language of the diasporic Jews, indexing learnedness and meekness, certain kinds of frailty. There's the Hebrew of the older generation, the parents and the educators that we saw in the clip, and the elevated standard of the new state establishment. And this indexes formality and institutionalized regulation. And then there's the Hebrew that's associated with the waves of immigration that arrive in the 40s and 50s. Each group hailing from a different linguistic community brings with it its own use of Hebrew, usually for liturgical purposes, right? So each group and its variety of liturgical Hebrew, and these index non-modernity, frailty, and overall foreignness, all of this, of course, from the Sabra perspective. So we can see in the new native vernacular and its alternatives, raw semiotic materials from which social meanings are constructed, where a composite set of microstances constructs a modern Jewish Israeli notion of authenticity via the following set of oppositions, where the first member designates the native value and the second its non-native negative. So we have assertive versus submissive, action-oriented versus wordy, direct versus opaque, natural versus pretentious, authentic versus planned, and modern versus traditional. And so now we can see how the negative values map onto the perception of the alternatives that we mentioned, where, for example, the first three, submissive, wordy, and opaque, index traditional scholarly Hebrew. The fourth and fifth, pretentious and planned, index the Hebrew of the non-native parents or educator generations. And the first and last, submissive and traditional, refer to the Hebrew of the new immigrants. And of course, there are also overlaps. When we think of all of these values on the native side, they also index a type of masculinity. And in this way, language becomes a primary site for the construction of a modern Jewish masculinity rooted in nation and sovereignty. the ideological connection to masculinity is, of course, not accidental. It contrasts with the ideological association of traditional Jewish language and femininity. In this way, the positive values of modern masculinity, nativeness, and vernacular authority reinforce each other in the emergent cultural matrix and closely track representations of masculinity, modernity, and authenticity that are familiar from the emergent post-war urban cultures throughout the West. So to make this a little bit more concrete, we can think about Strasberg's acting method, and in particular, Brando's portrayals in Streetcar Named Desire and On the Waterfront, or even Bob Dylan's shift to folk texts and his use of voice in the new music that he creates and sings. Another interesting source of semiotic material comes from Arabic. And during this period, during the mid to late 40s, many Arabic words were incorporated into Hebrew. This was usually identified with the culture of the Palmach. The Palmach was the commando segment of the underground military organization during the British Mandate. These words are all extremely common, like ahlan, dir balak, mabsut, and many, many, many more. And they became status symbols for the new identity. So we can ask, how can the widespread incorporation of Arabic words be reconciled with the broader ambivalence towards Arabic? And here, higher orders of indexicality are key. So higher orders indexicality refer to situations in which linguistic features index not just the social groups that are associated with those features, but also their attributes. So these words incorporate from Arabic, index Arabic speakers, Palestinians, but they also index attributes that correspond to a social evaluation of the group. Accordingly, the incorporation of Arabic words can be understood as a kind of appropriation within the native variety of attributes associated with the common perception of Palestinian Arabs, as part of a broader process of cultural appropriation, which extends to dance, dress, cuisine, and other forms of cultural expression. So we can ask, what does Arabic and Hebrew index? So most probably qualities of stereotypically perceived Arabic culture, such as the desire for direct and warm relationships. Also, most probably intimate familiarity with the land. And in addition, it probably also indexes native connection to the land, so that what is appropriated and incorporated into the new identity is Palestinian nativism. So let's take a step back and think a little bit more about authenticity, which is a core value for the new native vernacular, and what authenticity means in this context. So we looked at a set of stances that constructs a complex notion of authenticity, which is direct, transparent, natural, and native. But we should be careful because the notion of authenticity is deceptive. It presents itself as free of ideological intervention, in other words, as natural, but it is actually ideologically saturated and inextricably tied to authority. And in this case, the new vernacular authority of the native born. So to see that it's ideological, we have to recognize that authenticity and sincerity actually have a history. They have historical roots in modernity and in discourses related to the nation, and they vary minutely but profoundly from culture to culture. By the late 19th century, authenticity was understood in opposition to beauty, considered the superior member of the pair. Authenticity was the superior member of the pair, evoking also gendered nuances related to the meanings of authenticity within the emerging youth culture in the 1930s to 1950s in Israel, Palestine. Authenticity as offensiveness and also as masculinity. So authenticity is an ideological construct which implicates a consensus, since authenticity requires a process of authorization and value, since authentic objects have been ratified in the broader cultural context. These last two concepts, authorization and value, are directly related to our opening question. How does value accrue to linguistic varieties? Authenticity depends on a process of authorization, evoking authority, but also the reverse. Since authenticity is already invested with value, authentic things become authenticating for people who recognize their authenticity. So we can bring this back to the new native vernacular and see that it's authenticating for the native born generations, as it's authenticating as native. But crucially, not only, it's an inclusive variety. Once its value is recognized, the use of the native variety is authenticating for whoever adopts this way of speaking, thus performatively enacting a new kind of Jewish authority. So now we'll turn to look at Dan Ben-Amotz's text, Manishma, which means what's new. By the end of the 40s, the Sabras had become a recognized demographic group, and their native identity was an established fact. But their collective voice was still evolving and lacked public presence. Only in the 50s did the vernacular style and authority eventually emerge, thanks also to the activity of young cultural agents in popular arenas, especially journalism and entertainment. An important public platform for the enregisterment in the 1950s was Manishma, a weekly column by Dan Ben-Amotz, published in Dvar Shavua and Ma'ariv as a weekly column, and then published later in 1959 as a book, as a compilation. It supplied the native identity with its optimal articulation, a distinct new native vernacular style, and it generated an ongoing flow of vernacular representations, which we can see right here. Vernacular values were sometimes constructed in the columns via an imaginary native local folk, identified as Middle Eastern rather than European. An important feature is the presence of the author at these sites, and the imposition of his gaze produces a blueprint for Israeli-style Orientalism. So, who is Dan Ben-Amotz? From the 1950s to 1980s, he was an innovative and popular figure in Israeli pop culture, engaged in an extremely wide range of activities, ranging from journalism to film acting. Although he immigrated to Palestine from Poland in 1938 as a young teenager, many Israelis saw in him the epitome of Sabra identity. The fact that he was a known sexual predator did not detract from his public image during his lifetime. In Manishma, he functions as an iconic speaker. Not only does he master the new prestigious variety, he is also its authoritative producer and designer, one of many such cultural copywriters who were operating during the 1950s, along with Amos Kenan, Shaike Ophir, Chaim Topol, Shaul Bieber, and others, all male. So let's talk briefly about the style of the columns in general. The column style is a selective representation of the vernacular rather than a full imitation, probably because the representation of the vernacular in journalistic writing at the time was completely unthinkable. But representations of the vernacular do stand out, mostly in reported speech and also in the first person introduction, which we'll read in a minute. And in these parts, the language is unmistakably simple, and it's overlaid with vernacular lexical elements. And so it creates a general style that indexes naturalness and nativeness and is indexically linked to the sabras. The most telling part is the introduction, which frames the compilation as the ultimate representation of Sabra identity. Its reflexive title, without much introduction, discloses the fact that the book is geared towards a biased and familiar audience, which has no need for lengthy introductions. Don't I have better things to do than write introductions? I just love those guys who can't utter a word without first introducing it in 3 sentences. They get on my nerves. I get even more annoyed by these young writers who can't publish a collection of mediocre pieces without a bombastic introduction where they explain what any reader would gather without it. ... The column's goal is to provide an overview of the moods and thoughts of the people of this land. Its purpose is to express both the typical and the unusual in life. The material for the column is collected by a few people and edited by Dan Ben Amotz, who prefers to remain anonymous. The point of the plural conjugation is, on the one hand, to represent all of the contributors to the column, and on the other hand, to develop as objective a style as possible. ... You see, I told you, once you start with introductions, you're never done. If I hadn't opened my big mouth, I wouldn't have had to thank Dvar Shavua and Ma'ariv for having me for so many years in their commodious homes. Start reading the book already. How long does it take to read these yappings? Get going without much introduction. The text essentializes the links between the represented vernacular style and the attributed values of authenticity, modernity, and authority. The Sabra identity is foregrounded through a set of oppositions, which by now is probably familiar. So action versus wordiness, folksiness and simplicity versus pretentiousness, directness and truthfulness versus politeness, modernity and subversiveness versus complicity and obedience, vernacular language versus sophistication and learnedness. All of these values, when aligned, construct the new style. Another example is an Ulpan class. Ulpan is Hebrew school for new immigrants. According to Ben Amotz, this is a translation of an English letter from one of his loyal readers. The text mocks 2 types of non-native Hebrew: the students who use a rudimentary foreign Hebrew, which indexes foreignness, and the teacher, who is described as follows: about 50, glowing face, shiny bald head, narrow lips and smiling to his ears, apparently from Poland. Instead of sheen or samach, he pronounces a sound that almost sounds like taf. The absurdity of assigning a non-native speaker to be the face of modern Hebrew highlights the detachment of the Israeli establishment from social reality, as well as its hypocrisy. In this way, Benamot authenticates the native standard while delegitimizing its alternatives, and in this way inverts the decades-long tradition of educators rebuking sabras for their faulty language. Our last example. The columns also pay special attention to manifestations of local flavor. The authentic sites are indexed as simple, honest, and communal, often chosen for their Oriental nature, which could be either Arab or Jewish Mizrahi. So Party is a report from a bar mitzvah celebration. It exhibits a typical Orientalist mixture of condescension and admiration, desire, which in the Israeli context, this translates into a conventionalized stereotype of a generic Mizrahi, authentic and exotic, yet primitive and unsophisticated. The text opens with what seems like a shameless validation of sociocultural stereotypes of Mizrahi and Ashkenazi Israelis by positing a simple Moroccan woman against a vague impersonal we. The cleaning lady at our office is a Moroccan whose name is Esther. She works like a shadow floating around the furniture. Were it not for the washed floors and sparkling windows, we wouldn't have even noticed her. A few days ago, Esther said something for the first time, and with an earnest smile invited us to the bar mitzvah celebration of her son Yaakov, which was to take place that night. Only then, after many months of working at the office, we took a look and realized that she was a short woman of around 50 with a round belly, a wrinkled neck, which disappeared into a faded soft dress, and firm legs inserted into a scruffy pair of sandals. This description binds Esther's shabbiness and foreignness to simplicity, warmth, hospitality, physical strength, and directness, a concise display of the stereotype associated with Mizrahi identity. The interaction between Esther and the office workers resembles a first encounter between colonialists and natives. She's positioned within their gaze, her body examined and divided into meaningful attributes. The text then goes on to describe the surprisingly wonderful experience of the Moroccan gathering. The long hall was full of people, about 60, most of them Moroccans, spoke Hebrew and Arabic, most of them blue-collar workers. It was clear from their square and heavy hands, wearing their best clothes, dark suits with white pinstripes, white shirts buttoned up to the neck, not always shaven, like other real people, Italians, Frenchmen, Mexicans, not pretending, playing the way their ancestors had played. Ah, the Moroccan women, the office cleaners, vegetable vendors, trudging in sandals, poor, burdened with many children, sometimes hungry, vociferous, weepy. All of them were beautiful, truly beautiful. It isn't the fine clothes, the new shoes, or the colorful handkerchiefs. It's the glowing smiles on their faces, the true happiness, the steady, restrained hand clapping, the big merry eyes, the great appetite for eating, singing, laughing, loving, for anything essential in life. So in summary, what we see in Manishma corpus is not unlike what we saw in the style, the construction of authenticity and sincerity as a preference for action over words, in opposition to the hypocrisy of institutional regulation, and a fascination with and incorporation of values associated with non-European others, whether Arabic, Palestinian, or Jewish Mizrahi. So in conclusion, I'd like to try and think a little bit more about the relationship between language and identity in this context and language and embodiment. So we focused on enregisterment and on the consolidation of a hegemonic linguistic object. But at the same time, our study offers a perspective on the formation of a new subjectivity and a new identity, specifically a new masculinity. This is part of a broader project of homogenization in the service of the state and the creation of an ideal cohesive identity in the face of massive diversity. Looking at identity through the prism of language makes visible the raw materials and composite values from which the new masculinity was constructed at these particular historical and geographical junctures. The clip from the film and the images dispersed throughout the presentation depict these values as they were realized and especially idealized in the wider systems of social meanings co-constructed with language and language nativization. And it might be significant that they all apply to youth, mostly male youth, the images, embodiment. Even the teacher ends up throwing out all professorial propriety and succumbs to commando-like running over the hills. It's also significant that the field trip transpires in a quasi-liminal context. Liminality along with transgression on the part of the kids, but also the teacher, pioneership, and pre-adulthood was a formative experience for the forefathers and the Sabras. The images depict a set of embodied values: pleasure in nature, ruggedness, rambunctiousness, productivity, community, and leadership. In this way, linguistic and embodied practices align to produce a cohesive and legible gestalt with indexical iconicity playing an important interpretive role. It has sometimes been suggested that it's embodied variables that give semiotic meaning to linguistic variables rather than the reverse. However, in the case of the new native vernacular, the social meanings already associated with the historical and diasporic layers of Hebrew, along with the nebulousness of the new secular identities, may suggest that the embodied features do not predate the linguistic values, and they're actually co-constructed with and through language. In this respect, the new Zionist bodies are discursive, for those of you familiar with Judith Butler's work, produced through language and its alternatives and the ideologies surrounding them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Sichel. That was fascinating. And yeah, your last point about the language and ideology or identity as co-constitutive, as actually constructing one another and not one preceding the other, I think is a very strong point to end with. So now I invite our audiences to write their questions in the Q&A box. We already have one question there. I look forward to presenting your questions and getting answers to them. And I apologize in advance if we run out of time to answer everyone's questions. I'll start with a question of my own, if I may. So you've described the formation of this new identity of the Sabra and the vernacular Hebrew speaker as a masculine identity, and you also referred to a masculine cultural agent. So I'm curious to learn a little bit more about what was the role of women in this context of the creation or the construction of vernacular Hebrew and its ideological or identity aspects.
Yeah, okay, yeah, excellent question, and one that I think about a lot. So first, I mean, we can break down your question, which is like talks both about the contribution of women, but also what does it mean for women speakers, right? To speak a variety that is masculine. And what does that mean for gender formation on the feminine side? And So I think there are very complex negotiations to be discovered and thought about, right? Because one of the main points is that the variety was completely inclusive and opened its arms to whoever wanted to speak it, right? So it wasn't excluding anyone. On the contrary, everyone was invited to use it and to become nativized in the process. So I think it means that the negotiation of gendered identity in modern Israel for women is maybe a little different from the negotiation of gendered identity in Western bourgeois cultures, for example. So a famous sociolinguist, Robin Lakoff, wrote in the early 70s about the double bind that girls in American bourgeois culture find themselves in, because they're caught between, if they don't speak, if they speak like a girl, they won't be heard. But if they don't speak like a girl, they might get socially penalized. So maybe, and one way to start thinking about girls and women in this Hebrew variety is maybe that there's no penalizing for girls who are speaking like boys. The social stakes are a little bit different. So that's something to think about. Really interesting how that works and how the division, the language and gender division of labor varies from culture to culture and from historical circumstance to historical circumstance, and penetrates us in a very deep way, and really, works to construct certain kind of identities and makes certain things possible and other things not possible. Now, the second question about the contribution of women to this ethos is a great question. I mean, during the 40s and 50s, I haven't seen many women contributing back then. So there were the singing troops, the military singing troops, and Shaike Ophir we had, and Chaim Topol, and some of these were that I showed in the pictures were singers and important. They began their careers then. Nomi Pulani was a woman who wrote some of these skits early on in the mid 40s and late 40s. And she's almost the only woman who I identified in that period as an important cultural agent. Another famous person is Nitiva Benihuda, who was born in 1923 and raised by a father who was principal of Gymnasia Herzliya, so very elevated, engineered Hebrew in the home. She fought with the Palmach. So she was part of this ethos. She writes about it in the 80s. So what's interesting about the writing is that it's completely vernacular Hebrew. It's writing in vernacular Hebrew. And she says explicitly in the introduction that this is divrut and not sifrut. It is speakerly writing rather than literature. So to enhance my authoritative depiction of the events of the Palmach, she wants to be believed. And she explicitly links her writing style, which is speakerly, hence authentic, with the sincerity of what she's saying. So that's a very interesting text and person to think about. Unfortunately, she didn't write in the 50s, so it's a little bit belated.
We could maybe think about this in the Du Boisian term of double consciousness, like how women need to have a double consciousness of self and other, of how they are thought and heard of, and how they are expected to be heard. Really interesting. Thank you. So I want to read another question from our audience. The first question is from Professor Leora Halprin. What other world languages demonstrate patterns similar to the patterns you have observed with vernacular Hebrew? Knowing, of course, that Hebrew has some unique features. And what do these comparisons help us understand about modern Hebrew and its development?
Excellent question. So I haven't done any granular comparative work, but I think that the project invites comparative work, specifically with other vernacular varieties which ascended to the status of a national language in the 20th century, as opposed to the 19th century, right? So there was a big struggle over Greek, and which is similar to the debate about Hebrew, because Greek is, has a glorious past. And so there was a very long debate in modern Greece about the kind of Greek that we should use as the national standard. Should it be demotiki, one of the vernaculars, or a more elevated hybrid style that incorporates different features from different layers of classical Greek? The debate is relevant and Greek is relevant, but not so much for the values of authenticity and modernity, because that was in the first part of the 19th century. I think if we're interested in the values of authenticity, modernity, and masculinity, perhaps we need to look at this process happening in the 20th century. And so I think the Baltic languages, Lithuanian, Latvian, Finnish, have similar timelines to modern vernacular Hebrew, except of course that they weren't revived after 2000 years of dormancy. They don't have that aspect, but they are vernacular varieties that then are being promoted explicitly by cultural agents, by writing literature in these vernaculars and promoting it explicitly, that bring it to the status. So I think the Baltic languages, maybe Bulgarian as well, could be some interesting places to look for parallels.
Thank you. Moving on to our next question from Professor Mika Ahugia, also in our audience today. She says, or she writes, "Thank you for this fascinating presentation. When you were discussing the new masculinity, you mentioned its contrast with the femininity of traditional Jewish language. Were you referring to Yiddish, Rabbinic Hebrew, or other diasporic Jewish languages?"
Thank you. Thank you for these questions. They're really excellent and highly relevant. So first, I want to point out that femininity is from a certain ideological perspective, obviously, right? It's a social meaning as well. And so it was the Sabra perspective vis-a-vis Yiddish, the perceived frailty of the speakers of Yiddish, which aligned with anti-Semitic writings about the hidden language of the Jews. Some of you might be familiar with Sander Gilman's project on Jewish self-hatred and the hidden language of the Jews. He wrote a 400-page book tracking anti-Semitism, specifically about how the languages of the Jews and how the Jews use language, beginning in the modern, the early modern era. So from the 1500s or 1600s all the way up to the modern period. And he goes through different phases. It's really, really interesting. But it's most interesting at the point at which the Jews shed their accents and are no longer, and their language in the German-speaking world specifically is no longer recognizable as Jewish. And it's at this point that the science of race, so this coincides with the science of race, decides that it's not the language, it's the whole Jewish approach to what language is that's deficient. The Jews don't, and this is coming from the German-speaking world perspective, what the Jews don't understand is that language should be a transparent medium for conveying content. They don't get it. They continue to refer to the materiality of language in wordplay, in Talmudic pilpul, in certain kinds of language games that they played. They're constantly referring to the materiality and misunderstanding the true function of language. And this type of characterization of the Jews' orientation, deficient orientation towards language, is extremely close to the depiction of women's deficient orientation towards language at the same period. The idea was that women use language to adorn themselves, to conceal rather than to reveal. They're all about the adornment and the concealment rather than revealing. So again, a misunderstanding of language as an ideally a transparent medium. And so coming back to your question, the association of the Jewish orientation towards language, at least in the German-speaking world, comes very, very close to the characterization of women's use of language. Whether or not the Sabras were actually like explicitly aware of this is a very, very interesting question that, I don't think we can answer. But it is the case that even without knowing what we know, people do have a sense of generational, features of generational oppression. So they could have been responding to that history as well as to Yiddish and to rabbinic Hebrew, as in the Talmud, as in Jonathan Boyarin's writings about femininity and rabbinic Judaism. So all of those things, I think.
Yeah. Thank you. I want to turn to our next question from our guest, Amy Paulson-Reed, and maybe I should have started with it, but it goes to show that me as a native Hebrew speaker, I didn't even notice. She asks, can you explain the term Dugri style?
Oh, yes.
Which I took for granted, but yeah, some of our audience don't actually know it.
Yes. I should have explained it in a little bit more detail. It's the name that that the style has been given. Dugri is taken from Arabic, so it's an example of an incorporation of a word from Arabic with a slightly changed meaning. So in Arabic, Dugri means honest, just to be honest. Used in Hebrew, it means, let me be straightforward with you. So I might be a little bit confrontational. I might be a little bit in your face. Let me give you a heads up and say, I'm now going to be Dugri with you, right? So there's a connection to honesty, but in the Israeli context, it takes on these extra meanings, which are emblematic of the style. Yep.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.
So we have another question from Jacqueline Levy Marquez, asking a more contemporary question. Is the Academy on the Hebrew Language addressing non-binary identity? Hebrew is a gender-based language. That is to say, even the word you will communicate if a person is he and she. So how modern Hebrew is actually addressing non-binary identity?
Yes, thank you. Excellent question. So indeed, gender in language is a sensitive topic these days, both for non-binary identity and also because in a different place but related, because of the convention that we use masculine plural to address a mixed audience of males and females, even if there's only one guy, we should use masculine plural. So that's an issue as well, not unrelated. And so Uri Mo, my co-author, is actually a member of the Hebrew Academy of Language. And so he's involved in some of the more progressive activity that's happening right now at the Hebrew Academy of Language. There are conversations about gender inclusion. I would suspect that they are more on the side of inclusion in a mixed audience But there are also interesting initiatives outside of the Hebrew Language Academy to, for example, to create a gender inclusive written language. I don't know if you're familiar with it. So a font.
Tell us.
So there have been created special fonts which for plural endings, right? So the plural ending in Hebrew, let's say in the present tense for nouns, we have im for masculine plural and ot for feminine plural. The new font has merged the shape of the letters together to create a gender neutral plural ending to use as a font. And you,
how would you pronounce that in speaking?
right, yes. So this is for writing, right? So it is for writing. I don't think that it's to be directly pronounced, but it's a start to begin with, a font that can be embedded in your fonts. People can start using it on their word processor if they wish to. It's being circulated. It's brand new. So to Smardar's question, how do you pronounce? People are starting to say, I mean, in certain circles, right? Language change happens in certain circles, and either it manages to spread or doesn't. So in some progressive circles, people say muzmanimot, so just tack the two endings one onto the other to have both of them.
So that's a combination of muzmanim and muzmanot.
So the im and the ot, yeah, one after another. People do that. They do that in writing as well. But the non-binary language is, I mean, it's a good issue to be thinking about. For example, should Hebrew use they? Singular they. Would that be a useful tool for the expression of non-binary identity?
Because they is different for masculine and feminine, right?
It's exactly, because they in English is non-gendered, right? The minute that you go to plurals in Hebrew, you have to pick whether it's going to be feminine or masculine. And also because they has already been used for hundreds of years to refer to groups of people of whose gender whose identity we're unsure. They hung their coat in the other room. People have been saying for a long time to refer to people of whose identity we're not sure. So there is a kind of basis for then building singular they as an indication of non-binary identity on top of an already existing singular use of they. So whether to use the same tool in Hebrew or not, I think is really interesting issue to think about, and we'll see.
Yeah, we will see, because it's really in flux right now, right? It's developing as we speak.
Yes.
I'll maybe ask another question that kind of was in my head while you were speaking. So you talked about different types or different registers of language that kind of parallel. If I take the work of sociologist Max Weber, he has categories of authority. So he divides authority into traditional authority, rational or legal authority, and charismatic authority. Mm-hmm. So if I take that to your presentation, so traditional would be like the scriptures, the language of the scriptures, and the rational would be the educator's language that you talked about, or the Academy for the Hebrew language, right? The formal, kind of modern but formal language. But then on the charismatic, I think you use different categories. So both, or authenticity, or native, being local, being native, or experience-based. So there were variety of parameters working there. And I wondered if you could say a little more about that. Is that a diversity of different factors, or is there some kind of a structure or hierarchy to them, or are they just the same, spoken differently?
Yeah, that's interesting. I wasn't aware of the pre-existing work on this. I'd be interested in reading it. So, but I think we're thinking of the non-textual authority and non-rational scientific authority, the last one, as one kind, which is experience-based. And that the reason that an experience-based authority emerged is because, the Jews have been waiting and fantasizing for millennia, for the return to the land and the birth of native speakers. So it is an opportunity for claiming authority. And because the language is so different from the text, and the struggle to legitimize it. So the struggle to legitimize it really creates a revolution in where authority comes from, in the source of authority. And I would say that then authenticity is a value that's promoted as part of the promotion of this experience-based authority.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for our audience for joining us. And thanks again for the donors who make this event possible. Save the date for our upcoming Strum lectures on May 10th and 12th, where historian Lila Corwin-Berman will look at questions of Jews' citizenship and belonging in the United States over the course of American history. We will now end the webinar, and thank you all again.